Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Telecom video, we're going to be further discussing frame rates and resolutions as well as level of detail, and primarily we're going to be discussing Ryse of Rome. Because there's been recent news that Crytek have of course lowered the internal rendering resolution of what's being rendered at in the frame buffer from 1080p to 900p, so that would be 1600 by 900. And in addition to that, we're also looking at a rather large drop in quality on the models. Originally they were about 150,000K, and now they've been dropped to about 85,000 triangles, and we'll go into that in just a moment. And some people have been wondering why this is, and I've got one or two small messages regarding this actually. And as far as I understand it from the research that I've done, it's actually because the title, when it was running E3, because at E3 it looked incredibly impressive, I have to confess. But it turns out from my research that they were running on a Windows 7 PC with a GTX 780. Now, in case you're unfamiliar with the GTX 780, it's roughly 4 T-flops of computing performance. I think it's just a few G-flops under it, but it's pretty much, I mean, obviously that's dependent on whether the GPU is boosting. Boosting, by the way, is the GPU, if it's got thermal overhead and power surplus, it can automatically increase its clock speed. But generally speaking, it's about 4 T-flops of computing power, which is about twice that of the PlayStation 4, and of course just over twice that of the Xbox One. Well, it's actually about 3 times the Xbox One, but regardless. So let's discuss this for a little bit. There's still some more stuff I want to do on the frame rate side of things, but I wanted to put this video out because I wanted some thoughts on this first. Now, before anyone jumps on this and starts to, you know, overly criticize either Crytek, we'll go into their tweets in a moment, by the way, or the Xbox One, there's a couple of things I'd like to point out. Firstly, the original Xbox, well, the Xbox 360, should I say, the original, there are a couple of titles on it which didn't actually achieve the resolution of native 720p. For example, Project Gotham Racing 3, I think Perfect Dark, and Microsoft were originally aiming at the magical 720p. That was like what they considered to be the, you know, the future next generation kind of resolution, but the Xbox 360 didn't. And as it turns out, the 360 was actually slightly more powerful than the PS3 in terms of pure raw GPU performance. I believe it handled more triangles or polygons per second as well, but it just so happened that they didn't really know the hardware that much. However, the Xbox One has been kind of a moving target. There's been, of course, the CPU upclock as well as GPU upclock. Obviously, the CPU upclock, in terms of raw percentages and in terms of pure numbers, has been significantly higher. You're looking at 53 versus 150 megahertz, which is not bad. I mean, it's about 6.7% increase on the GPU and about 10% on the CPU, which is, you know, fairly respectable. And Microsoft themselves have said that they actually got more of a frame rate increase regarding the performance of the Xbox One from the CPU increase, because they're saying that a lot of titles are CPU bound. Unsure how true that is, but obviously I don't really see why they'd lie about it or whatever, but there you have it. So let's discuss this a little bit. So the news actually originated from Savat Yeli. I'm hoping I've pronounced that right. That is, of course, Y-E-R-L-I from Crytek. And he made a tweet and he said, and I quote, Hero Marius, 85,000 polys. It was a choice, 150,000 polys with LODs versus 85,000 plus better shading plus no LODs, stable. The later, without better quality. Now, in case you're not really able to decipher that tweet, and sometimes tweets are not exactly the easiest things to read simply because of the character limit, and one of the things I dislike about Twitter, but, you know, whatever. That basically means they've gone from 150,000 triangles to about 85,000 triangles. And so we can ascertain that 1080p at 60 frames per second with 150,000 polygon count characters was pretty much the game running on a very high-end Windows-based PC. Well, I'll say Windows-based, it could have been Linux or whatever, but basically high-end PC hardware. So, what does this mean? Well, the developers have also revealed that Crytek, the CryEngine with Ryse is actually doing things in real time. What 3 years ago would have been pretty much had to have been a CGI movie, in other words, pre-rendered, and that would have taken hours to render a single frame. They've also employed, and I quote, advanced level of detail techniques. Now, these are basically to help to remove levels of detail as the characters move further away from the screen. And this is dependent on item level on characters, so there's no real switch of model details all at once, so in other words things can fade in and out much more naturally. He also pointed out that the Xbox One was very powerful, and he said combined with the power of the CryEngine, Xbox One allowed them to use film practices in real time on Ryse, and those were his words. It definitely seems a case where frame rate and resolution is already starting to become a little bit of a thing on next generation consoles. Now, I just want to point out that it's most likely that they will, and by they I mean of course the developers, will become more familiar with hardware of the Xbox One later on, so they'll probably be able to do better. It's also worth noting that I don't think even the PlayStation 4, despite the fact that it has about a 500 G-flop advantage, would actually be able to run the title how we saw it at E3. There's just too much of a discrepancy between the 780 and the PlayStation 4 hardware. There is just too much of a discrepancy, in my personal opinion. Obviously, it's still early yet. What are my thoughts on this? Well, I had wondered, because when I saw Ryse, there was some frame rate slowdown that I had noticed, and there was some occasional dicey physics, just physics that just didn't really seem to make sense when you watched it being played. A little bit of iffy hit detection, that type of thing, but overall it looked incredibly impressive, and I had thought to myself, this does look pretty damn amazing. The game didn't particularly look my type of thing, if I'm honest, but graphically it was very hard to fault. However, of course, since we've learned that it wasn't really native, and I have a few issues with that. I do understand that they may not have been comfortable enough with the Xbox One's hardware, or maybe the build wasn't far enough, or maybe the code wasn't optimized enough, or maybe they were still trying to get used to the levels of detail. Whatever. Obviously, the PlayStation 4, on Killzone, we had the news just recently that they were talking about the multiplayer aspect of things, and they've said that they're going to be trying to target 60 frames per second generally for multiplayer, and this is the game taking, I believe, 48 units, which would be 24 players times one of their drones each, so obviously 24 times 2. Another point I'd like to make is that with the advanced level of detail thing, this is actually pretty important, because as a model becomes further and further away from the camera, just how you can't see, for example, a piece of paper that's getting further away from your face, obviously depending on your eyesight, but even if you've got very good eyesight, if it becomes far enough away, you won't be able to read it. In other words, its detail simply diminishes, or what you can perceive of the detail diminishes. And this is true of pretty much anything in real life. Obviously, if you're far away from a tree, you may not be able to make out the individual branches or whatever. And so in gaming, of course, the difference is unlike in real life, the level of detail never changes. It's just your perception of it which changes. In other words, the level of detail, the branches don't suddenly mold into one just because you're not, just because you're far away. It's, it's always the same. It's just physically you're not able to distinguish the differences. However, in gaming, it's not like that, and when things are far away from the camera, they're not rendered in such high resolutions, or if they're being obscured by something, then you're going to have clipping, or basically a portion of the object simply won't be rendered. So let's say you have a wall obscuring, let's say, a car, and you go behind that wall, so you're no longer able to see the car will physically just no longer be rendered, simply because it doesn't need to. So it saves basically GPU cycles as well as memory bandwidth and many more things besides. So that's just obviously, advanced techniques have been around for a while now. The Unreal engines, for example, have made significant strides towards it. I'm fairly certain that the new Unreal is also going to do the same thing. It's also worth noting that the PlayStation 4 has had issues with engines as well. I mentioned a couple of times about SVOGI, which is an advanced lighting effect which was originally intended to be shipping with Unreal Engine 4, but they pretty much pulled it, and they have said it's too expensive, and I don't mean obviously for the studio to develop, I'm talking about in terms of GPU cycles. And there have been some mixed feelings there, primarily that they believe, well, I'm talking about users, although obviously the studios haven't confirmed or denied this, but the basic theory is that they know that hardware, the average hardware, which would of course be the console, which will probably represent the average PC specifications, or the lower to mid-range PC specifications for the next 1 to 2 years, for example, after their release, it's simply not able to handle that. And they originally were demoing SVOGI on, I think it was the Elemental demo. You guys can actually check that out. I've got an Elemental demo, PS4 versus PS4 versus PC. It's actually really cool. And one of the primary differences was actually SVOGI, and they've since changed it to a more simple global illumination lighting. And this is pretty much due to the fact that the GPU on the PS4 just can handle that level of lighting. I'm not criticizing it. They have made some definite improvements on the general global illumination of lighting. Another point I'd like to make, actually, going on about this just for a second longer before I close out, is this is actually another point that John Carmack made back on the QuakeCon 2013 speech that he gave about resolutions, and he said that, you've got to be a bit careful because you've got to maintain that smooth frame rate. He believes, of course, that 60 FPS at 1080p is like the holy grail. Unfortunately, in reality, not all games can achieve this, because there's a significant difference in terms of, for example, there's a significant difference between, say, 900p and 1080p. You're looking at about 44% increase in pixels, which would be 1440000 or 1,440,000 versus almost 2.1 million pixels. You guys can do the maths on that yourselves. If you want, you simply times 1600 by 900 or 1080p by 1920 by 1080, or for example 1280 by 720 or whatever. So yeah, pretty easy stuff. But so obviously when you take that into account, the amount of memory it's taking up in the frame buffer, although that's not too much of a big deal now, I suspect some of it could be to do with ROPS, raster operations, but it's a bit difficult to know. Obviously some of this could simply be that they haven't optimized the code as well, and they'll become more familiar with it. Anyway, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've found it somewhat informative. I've got some more stuff that I want to be doing on frame rates and stuff. I still need to do part 2 on my thing, but there's been so much news recently regarding this. I wanted to kind of wait and then do a final thoughts on this with all the information at hand. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.